Welcome to DT Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. I'm DT Kane, author of the epic fantasy series The Acktus Saga and the spoken books Uprising. Each week, I read from one of my novels, discuss my writing process, answer your questions, and have general discussions about fantasy fiction. It's like a book club, except I do all the work for you. Find show notes, info about all my novels, and much more at dtkane.com. Here's the show. Part 1. Chapter 1. Reading books can get you killed. Bastian stopped mid-sentence, the words turning oily and stale in his mouth, and glared up from the book his brother had set in front of him. They were sitting cross-legged across from each other on the cold stone floor of Torchsire Library's speaking room. "You say that every time," yelled Tex. "I get it, all right?" Tex pursed his lips. He hated being called by his full name. "I repeat it because you don't really get it, Baz. It's not your fault. You can't until you've seen what it can actually mean. Do you remember Dad?" Baz looked away. Of course he didn't. He'd only been 3 when it had happened. Perhaps he possessed a recollection or two of the tales Dad had used to tell of sailors braving the ocean vast. But even those might just be invented memories from how many times Tex had repeated those stories in the years since their father's death. "Sorry," Tex said, running a hand over his shaved head, the only hairstyle permitted to speakers. "I know, you were too young, but the fact remains, he couldn't read, and the readers still killed him because they suspected he was beginning to grasp the basics of the scribe's grammar. He never even laid eyes on the text of a spoken book. You have to be careful." Baz huffed out a sigh. "You spend as much time warning me as you do teaching me. I know the readers are cruel, but if this is really so dangerous, why are we doing this at all?" Tex's brows dropped over his probing green eyes. Unlike most speakers in the dreary city of erstwhile, Tex had olive-toned skin, accentuating the brilliance of his eyes. Baz had similar eyes, but his complexion was pale as a ghost compared to his brother. Whereas Tex's eyes looked like a fortune of emeralds, Baz's were more like pea soup in dirty porcelain bowls. "Because," Tex said, voice gaining an edge, "I promised Dad I'd take care of you, and a man always keeps his promises. That's what sets us apart from the readers, Baz. We keep our word. Don't forget that." Baz nodded, shifting uncomfortably. Why did Tex always have to be so serious? "And," Tex added, "someone ought to be able to stand up to them. There's power in knowing the words, Baz. I can't think of a better way to watch out for you than to give you some of that power." Baz sighed. Power and knowledge. Power in knowledge. Tex was always talking like that. A quiet determination that he'd had for as long as Baz could remember, and one that Tex was set on passing on to him. Baz was slightly less concerned with such lofty goals, and more with setting things on fire. He was, after all, a destroyer. One reason he and Tex were allowed time alone at all was because Tex was a try, able to call forth the power of any of the types of spoken books: creation, destruction, and influence. Only 1 in 1,000 speakers had such talent, and it made him extremely valuable, so he received extra privileges. Now, that didn't mean the readers treated him as an equal. He was still a slave. All speakers were. But among slaves, it's a great freedom to have even small parts of your waking hours to yourself, and Tex was given an hour a day for rest. He was supposed to take the time to relax in silence, give his voice a chance to recover after all the speaking that was required of him each day. In reality, he spent most of that time each day with Baz, and recently they'd spent that time poring over the spoken book he'd hidden under a loose flagstone in the Duke's speaking room. The room was as spacious as it was cold. It was at the end of a long hallway, set apart from the rest of Torchsire Library, as were all speaking rooms. It wasn't common, but speakings could go terribly wrong if a speaker mispronounced a significant word, or a reader was sloppy in his or her recitation to the speaker. The speaking room at Prashant Library had been entirely razed by a destruction spell gone awry about 10 years ago, shortly before Baz had been born. At one end of the room, upon a raised dais, was a shelf about half full with spoken books. It was one of the smaller libraries in Erstwhile, but still enough books to be considered a grand fortune. The shelf was, of course, protected by locked iron grating, the space between its cross-hatched bars so minimal it was difficult to read the titles inscribed on the book's spines. The only other furnishings in the room were a lectern made of polished mahogany and a single chair behind it. Those were for the house's readers, of which Torchsire had 10, plus a few children in training. Speakers were never permitted to sit while they repeated the words of the books. Bad posture made for less powerful speakings, or so the reader said. Baz wasn't convinced. Tex had never told Baz where he'd gotten the book they were now reading, but it could only have come from this room. Books never left it without close scrutiny, and a book in the hands of a speaker was grounds enough for immediate execution, so Tex certainly hadn't carried it into the speaking room from elsewhere. It'd likely been left on the lectern after a reading, and Tex had nabbed it during one of his rests. That had been maybe a year ago. Baz could vaguely recall the Duke being in a rage over a missing book, questioning all the library servants on suspicion one of them had stolen it. Such things weren't entirely unheard of. If one could find a buyer, the price of a single spoken book would be enough for a common illit to retire on. Of course, in practice, a book in the hands of an illit was about as illiquid an asset as they come. Might as well wear a sign saying you're a thief. Well, Baz said, I won't be able to do much standing up to anyone if you never teach me anything. Patience, Baz. Patience. Come on. I was nearly able to light the candle last time. Let me read and try again. Tex's jaw set to a stern line for a moment, but then his face softened. He looked down and to one side for a moment, a small smile momentarily crossing his lips. Baz hated that look. What? He demanded. Nothing, Tex said, still smiling. It's just nothing. Come, you're right. Caution only gets us so far. I must actually teach you something. Great, Baz said. He bent back over the book, placing a finger on the page at the beginning of the string of words that could call forth flame. They were strange, curly characters with the occasional sharp edge thrown in for good measure. He opened his mouth and, Wait, Tex said. Did you bring your heat source? As you gain ability, you'll be able to pull power directly from the elements in the ink, but you're not there yet, and it's cold as the icy heights in here. You'll need some sort of starter. Baz looked over his shoulder to hide a grimace. He ought to have thought of that. It's just, he was so excited. Deliritus, the Duke's son, never let him do anything interesting like create fire. Baz leapt up and hurried over to the dais, where he left the small brazier of coals he'd brought with him from the small room in the library's basement he shared with Tax. Careful not to burn his hands, he picked it up and brought it back over to where Tax was sitting. Good, Tax said once he'd returned. Now remember, what's the most important thing for a destroyer to remember? Tax pointed to the destroyer's mark, branded to Baz's forehead. Baz sighed. Would Tax ever let him get around to actually speaking? The stop rune, Baz said, rolling his eyes. He jabbed a finger at the symbol in the spoken book that he'd once more propped in his lap. Good, Tax said. And why is it important? Baz wasn't going to fall for that trick again. Actually, there's 2 reasons it's important, Tax. His brother nodded, that same smile touching his mouth as before. Go on. First, it locks the reading, tells the book to only cast the spell the one time I speak it. That way, someone can't repeat what I say and cast it again. And second, if something goes wrong, I just have to speak the stop rune, and the power will cease to flow, and I can start over. Tax nodded again. All right. Now focus your intent in your mind. The words are vital, but reading and speaking must be done with purpose. Careful with your diction, and don't be afraid to speak the stop rune a second time if you feel the words slipping away from you. Better to start over than have to explain a singed mouth to Deliritus, or worse, the Duke. This time, Baz was unable to hide his grimace. That had been a near thing a few weeks prior. He'd been so close to completing the speaking for Minor Fire, but then he'd slipped over the line's final syllable and, well, that wouldn't happen again. Taking a deep breath, he focused on the text then uttered the stop rune and plunged into speaking the sentences that would summon fire and light the candle that Tax had produced from within the folds of his robe. One who has never heard the words of a spoken book uttered might think they have a good idea of what it would sound like. Just like talking, except reciting words from a page, right? Wrong. Each of the three languages of the Trinity are distinct from the common speech, and each is as distinct from the other as water is from flame is from earth. Baz had once heard a conservator compare the language of creation to a doe lapping water from a creek, and the language of influence to the drumming of marching men's steps, steady and inevitable. Destruction, however, wasn't nearly so straightforward. Some of its syllables were like the menacing snort of a bull, others a falcon's high screech, and still others like the refined, sharp edges of a lion's roar. As Baz spoke the words, he could feel their power building. His mouth began to grow warm, the coals in the brazier steaming as if water had been poured upon them, their heat dissipating, though not into the air above the brazier, but into the syllables, then words, then sentences that flowed from Baz's mouth. His lungs began to burn, but he resisted the urge to breathe. Breathing in the middle of a speaking was dangerous. Unless you were absolutely certain of your timing, you'd pay a price. And Baz certainly couldn't afford scorched lungs. Even Tax wouldn't be able to explain that to the Duke. Finally, he gasped out the last syllable, feeling a tang on the roof of his mouth as it didn't leave his tongue quite right. Baz ignored it, instead focusing his will on the wick of the candle in Tax's hand. The air between them glimmered with heat, popping beads of sweat onto both their foreheads. The candle burst into flame. Baz sucked in a breath of air, shuddering at the heat of it, but it was just the ordinary warmth of the air that had been heated by his spell, not the burning of a misuttered speaking. He threw both arms into the air. Yes, finally. Well done, Tax said, a broad smile illuminating his eyes. I couldn't have done it better myself. That was a blatant lie. Tax could have spoken the words 3 times as fast and lit 10 candles in the time it had taken Baz to light the one, but that didn't matter. The praise still felt like sunshine on a cloudy day. Let's do another one, Baz said, flipping ahead several pages in the book. Maybe I can try the one that heats metal to orange. I can try it on the brazier. Whoa, hold on, Baz. Let's not get ahead of... The large double doors to the speaking room suddenly swung open. Tax, are you in here? They both froze, eyes meeting in horror. 2 speakers alone with a spoken book? Father had been killed for less. Slowly, their eyes turned in unison to see who had discovered them. Chapter 2. I say, Tax, where are you? Standing at the now open doors was a pair of legs topped by a heaping stack of books. A wide-brimmed hat with a purple feather sticking from the top poked from around the stack's edges. Though his face was blocked, it had to be Deliritus Torchsire, first of his name, heir to the Torchsire Library. No one else would, or would be permitted to, walk about the library carrying many fortunes' worth of spoken books in such a haphazard manner. Some would say his status as heir wasn't by choice, but necessity, as he was the Duke's only living child. While Baz continued to gawk, Tax moved into swift action. Muttering a few words, the candle snuffed out. There was no residual smoke, and only the most observant would have noted the slight shake in Tax's hand. There'd be a burn there later, where he transferred the candle's heat. He placed their special bookmark in the spoken book, then slid the tome and candle into the hole exposed by the loose flagstone and set the stone atop it. Just as Tax was nestling the final corner of the flagstone into place, Deliritus's face emerged from behind the stack of books he held, yellow hair half covering his blue eyes. He was 13 years old, and while he'd begun to grow, he was shorter than average, yet at that awkward stage where clothes didn't fit him no matter what the tailors did. The pile of books in his hands wobbled. Tax yanked his hand away from the stone, a small corner still poking unevenly from the rest of the floor. "Tut, tut," yelled Tax. "I don't let you keep your eyes for gawking. It's so you can help me in times such as these. Here, take these books. Father will be letting me do this afternoon's reading, and I was practicing. Those hard acts of destruction, the ones that come from the back of your throat, get me every time. My tonsils are still sore. Baz had to bite his lower lip to prevent a grin. Deliritus had been reading for years and still could barely pronounce most words of the Trinity. Tex hurried over to take the books from Deliritus. There was no suggestion of rebellion in him when Deliritus was about. Calm subservience was the only sentiment Tex ever emoted around him. But that was just the way of things. Readers led and speakers followed. Baz didn't like it, but unlike his brother, didn't see a chance of it changing anytime soon, even if young children like himself did learn how to read. "Don't worry yourself, Master Deliritus," Tex said. "The dictions of destruction are too harsh for a man of your generous constitution. I'll understand what you mean when you speak the words to me." That's better," Deliritus said, relieved of his burden. He made his way up to the dais. "Well, I suppose you're right. It's not as if I'm the one who needs to be perfect after all, yes? It won't be my mouth that burns if I misutter the words." He smiled as if he'd made a joke. When Tex didn't laugh, and instead busied himself steadying the stack of books he'd been handed, Deliritus cleared his throat and smoothed his velveteen tunic, though there were no wrinkles in it. Baz openly glared at Deliritus, partly over his insensitivity, partly because it was plain he still hadn't even noticed that Baz was there. "Well, never mind my diction. We must go on regardless. Come, join me on the dais, and we'll prepare before the first of the Illits arrive with their supplications. I expect Father will have left me nothing but common sniffles and broken brooms, but a reading is a reading, after all. Father said I didn't even need supervision this time, and, Bastian, I didn't even see you there." Baz quickly blanked his face and gave a curt bow. Tex was afforded certain liberties, a tolerance for his freely speaking to Deliritus among them, but Baz, along with the vast majority of other speakers, was expected to remain silent unless a question was directed to him or he was actively repeating a reader's words from a spoken book. As often as not, a reader would assume that a speaker who opened his mouth out of turn was attempting to cast a spell, and if a reader believed that, well, speakers were far less expensive to replace than a reader. Deliritus said, looking around the room as if there might be some place he could hide Baz. Of course there wasn't. The speaking room was completely unfurnished, save for the shelves, the lectern, and chair on the dais. Just a large open space in which supplicants could wait as the reader listened to their entreaties and granted them as he or she saw fit. Apparently coming to this realization, Deliritus gave a smile that was half a grimace. "I suppose you can turn the pages. Just don't say anything, all right? My fingers still tingle at the thought of what happened the last time I let Yeltax talk me into letting you perform a speaking." Baz's face reddened, and he looked away from Deliritus, equal parts shamed and furious. The Torchsire heir grimaced at the reaction he'd caused. "I'm sorry," but Deliritus stopped himself before he finished and coughed loudly. Property isn't something to which you apologize, Baz thought, still looking away to hide the anger he knew must be showing in his eyes. "Well, anyway," Deliritus said, "Rox always gets cranky when I make him turn my pages. Prefers to be free to watch the supplicants for signs of danger. Sworn to protect me, and words mean what they mean, and all that nonsense he's always saying." "One's nonsense is another's truth," a voice boomed from the hall beyond the speaking room's doors. Deliritus rolled his eyes. "Oh, Rox, always so droll. If I understand one thing in 10 you say, I count it a grand day." Rox moved into view. He made the tall oaken doors seem small. Shoulders nearly as wide as the entryway, he towered over Deliritus by a good 2 feet, and Deliritus wasn't particularly short. He was dressed all in gray, save for the faded leather jerkin that strained across his massive chest. Even his skin was an ashen color that nearly matched his clothing, causing him to blend into the library's stone walls. Compared to the rest of his body, his head seemed disproportionately small, though that may have just been an illusion caused by the leather mask he wore around his mouth and nose. Narrow slits allowed for breathing and permitted one to just make out the movement of his lips when he spoke. He was entirely bald, though his hairless pate showed several scars, badges of his vocation. Rox was Deliritus's harbor, his sworn protector. Bred and raised solely for the purpose of protecting readers, harbors were regarded as frightening killers, and Rox was no exception, save for one thing. He was a native of Enigma, one of Oration's 3 cities, and the one that specialized in the third branch of the Trinity, influence. He couldn't read, of course, but it was said all Enigmans had a peculiar way of speaking. They could take any sentence and make it mean whatever they wished, and not only that, but make you believe that's what you'd meant. The Duke had won Rox in a bet with an Enigman trader shortly after Deliritus had been born, and Rox had been his harbor ever since, watching over him since he'd been in the cradle. "Milord?" came a voice from the hall, somewhere behind Rox. Before Baz even realized someone had spoken, Rox spun, weapon in hand. A harbor's weapon is like no other. Whereas ordinary men use axes or swords, harbors are trained in the razor. In its compact form, it is a serrated blade, slightly longer than an average man's forearm, with a straight handle along the back allowing it to be wielded with either 1 or 2 hands. At first glance, it doesn't look like much more than a woodsman's saw, but in the hands of a harbor, the weapon can wreak havoc on human flesh in close quarters. And if the harbor's target is farther away, a snap of the wrist engages a hinge to one side of the handle, extending the blade out and more than doubling the weapon's reach, exposing a straight, cleaving edge opposite the serrated teeth. Rox used this latter function as he turned, razor extended in one hand, its jagged edge coming to rest at the neck of a slightly hunched woman dressed in a worn and faded dress, though it seemed freshly pressed. She was carrying a basket of chicks, their fuzzy yellow heads poking above the basket's rim. As she flinched away from the harbor, one of them toppled out of the basket and scurried between Rox's legs into the speaking room. "Stupid giant," Baz muttered, pouncing on the chick and scooping it up as gently as he could. "Rox!" Deliritus snapped. "Put that murder stick away. It's just one of the supplicants, though I would like to know who's supposed to be guarding the library's side entrance. You are a bit early, ma'am." Deliritus turned an apologetic smile to the woman, though her wide eyes were still focused solely on Rox, who had folded up his razor and taken a step away from her. "It must be the gap in the guard at the lunch hour, Master Deliritus," Tax said. "The gap in the—" Deliritus slapped a hand to his forehead. "Yes, of course. Ever since we caught that fellow stealing the silver last week and cast him out, Father's been looking for a replacement, but finances being as they are and—" Deliritus suddenly appeared to realize that the woman was listening to him. Her eyes were growing even wider than they had when Rox's razor had been at her throat. Deliritus's cheeks reddened noticeably. "Oh, don't you worry, good woman. Things were a bit tight there for a while after Father's injury, but the money's been coming in again these past few years. I'm sure that—" Tex cleared his throat to stop Deliritus's rambling. The woman's jaw was at risk of falling from her face onto the floor. Deliritus flushed. "Well, that explains the missing guard anyway," he muttered. "Yeltax, put those books down and draw back one of those curtains. Let's get some light in here. I'm sorry for the trouble, ma'am, and the Torchsire Library's apologies for how cold it is in here, but no fires in the speaking room. Not good for the books, after all." The woman appeared speechless for a moment, whether over being directly addressed by the heir of one of erstwhile's 9 libraries, or still from the shock of Rox's defensiveness. It was difficult to say. She shook her head, blinking her eyes several times. "It's all right, my lord, I'm sure. But, if I might be so bold, where is the Duke? I came for a speaking. My chicks, you see, they're sick, and I need them, the eggs. It's how I make my money." Baz might have just been imagining things, but Deliritus seemed to draw himself up a little taller. "I'll be doing the speaking today, good lady, and I see no reason to wait. Why don't we begin?" "Oh," said the woman, bending her head to one side as if imagining the Duke might be hiding somewhere on the dais behind Deliritus. "Are you certain, milord? I could come back another day if—" No, Deliritus cut in. "It's quite all right. Wouldn't want to inconvenience you. Come, Yeltax, attend me on the dais for the reading. You too, Bastion. If I recall right, the spell we'll need for this woman's chicks spans multiple pages. Killing's a prolonged process, even if it is only killing an illness. Lady, if you just give your offering to Rox there, we'll get started in a moment." The woman opened her mouth as if she wanted to say more, but shut it again and handed over a few coins when Rox held out a hand. The harbor's hand wasn't much smaller than the basket she carried, and the woman tossed the coins into it rather than risk touching him. Baz gave the chick he'd corralled a final pet and handed it back to the woman, giving her a look of commiseration. She smiled and took the bird, though her eyes darted away when they landed upon the destruction brand on his forehead. Baz turned away before she could see his scowl, heading for the dais. Deliritus was rummaging in the shelf of spoken books, which he'd unlocked with a large gold key with a glimmering sapphire set in its handle. "Now, Yeltex, which book of creation is that healing spell for poultry in?" Baz shot his brother a quick look, eyebrow arched. Tex just shook his head. This was what the future of the Torchsire Library depended on. Tex cleared his throat and leaned close to the youth, speaking quietly. "Pardon me, Master Deliritus, but if the lady's chicks have an infection, you'll be wanting a book of destruction to kill the disease. That one, I think." Tex pointed to a tome twice the size of the one Baz had been reading prior to Deliritus's arrival. It was bound in red leather with golden letters of destruction etched on its spine. "Right," Deliritus said. "Just testing you out, old Yeltax. You passed, of course." Baz rolled his eyes at Deliritus's turned back. A grunt that sounded more like the sneeze of a giant boar startled Baz so that he nearly stumbled off the dais. A quick glance over his shoulder revealed Rox towering over him. There was no way the harbor could have seen the derisive expression Baz had given Deliritus, but still he wiped all condescension from his face. No one made friends with a harbor, but you could certainly lower your chances of a harbor using his razor on you. Insulting the harbor's reader was not such a method. Deliritus removed the tome Tax had indicated and nearly dropped it as he made his way to the lectern. The lady twisted her hands on the basket's handle and looked sidelong toward the door, as if calculating whether she could make it there without Deliritus noticing. "Right," Deliritus said, flipping through the book's pages once he'd gotten it settled on the lectern. "We seem to have used this one a lot lately, old Yeltax. Ink's starting to fade. Make note that we'll need to send it to the conservator soon for restoration." Tax glanced at the book. "As you command, Master Deliritus, though, if I might be so bold, it appears there's enough elemental ink there for several more readings before the book will lose its power." Deliritus stopped flipping pages for a moment. Baz held his breath. "Don't let me catch you looking at a book's words again, Yeltax," Deliritus said, quiet enough that the woman waiting for the reading couldn't hear. A twitch at the edge of Tax's mouth was the only outward admission of error he showed. "Of course. My apologies." Deliritus began flipping through the book again, and kept flipping, then began flipping back the other way. "Why, good Yeltax," Deliritus said, an edge of frustration replacing the warning that had been in his tone, "are there so many words in a book that holds so few spells? This one can't have more than a dozen, and the longest doesn't have more than but a few pages of reading." Deliritus often complained of this, and Baz knew by now that he didn't expect an answer. A simple spell might require only a single spoken sentence, and even the most complex rarely required more than a few pages of text. But the rest of the book provided guidance on pronunciation and enunciation, detailed history of the spell's origins, and suggested uses. Also, unless one was using a starter, all that elemental ink was needed to provide sufficient fuel to power the spell. All things that Deliritus ought to have been committing to memory rather than complaining over. "Here it is," Deliritus finally announced. "Well, no need to dally. There'll be other supplicants here soon. Ready, Yeltax?" Tax took a deep breath and nodded. For all that he said against the readers in private, he always took his job of speaking seriously. Even if he was a slave, his speakings helped illits like the poor woman. "Move just a bit closer, Yeltax. Don't want you straining." Tax's lips thinned. He was only a handful of steps away from Deliritus and the book before him, easily close enough to draw power from the elements imbued in the book's ink. But arguing was pointless, and he shuffled a step closer. "Very good," Deliritus said. "Now, Bastion, be ready with the page turn." Baz nodded, making the incredibly stupid mistake of repeating Tax's earlier error by looking down toward the page Deliritus had stopped on to see the last few words written there. A growl from a wide-eyed Tax was all that saved Baz from a whole lot of explaining. Or worse. "I say," yelled Tax, "are you quite all right?" "Fine, Master Deliritus," Tax said, taking his eyes from Baz. "Just a new exercise to warm up my vocals is all." Well, I don't like it. But do what you must if it helps. Let's begin. Just hold out those chicks a little closer, my good woman, and we'll have them cured in a jiff." Without waiting to see if the woman complied, Deliritus stooped over the book like a gargoyle. He opened his mouth to begin, but once again Rox, who had moved to stand behind Tax, one hand on his razor, cleared his throat like the crash of a wave. Yes, Rox," Deliritus said, exasperated. "The stop rune, though I don't know what Yeltax could possibly do to me with a spell designed to cure chickens of a runny nose." He ran his finger over the page for a moment before apparently finding the rune and uttering it aloud. There was actually a third use of the stop runes that Baz hadn't given to Tax earlier. The readers used them to ensure that the speaker didn't cast the desired spell, then turn and speak it again, targeted at the reader. It was rare, but not unheard of, for a disgruntled speaker to attack his or her reader in such a manner, which was why Rox had moved to where he had. Any indication that Tax intended to turn the spell on Deliritus, or failure to utter the stop rune, and Baz would have a front row seat to the damage Rox's razor could inflict upon a human body. "Satisfied, Rox?" Deliritus asked. "Keep you from harm is the oath I swore," Rox rumbled in reply. "The words mean what they mean." Deliritus shook his head like he'd heard that dozens of times before, which, of course, he had. In fact, Baz had heard Rox say that dozens of times before. Surely Deliritus had heard it thousands. Good. Then let's start with the words that actually matter. Deliritus began reading in the guttural tones of destruction. His pronunciations were all off. Voice moving like silk over what ought to have been hard consonants, rolls of the tongue that ought to have been snaps. For a lesser speaker, such incompetence would have been a disaster. But Tax was one of the best speakers in all erstwhile, and he ignored Deliritus's floundering, repeating the words that came stammering out of Deliritus's mouth with perfect diction. Baz followed the movements of his brother's mouth, admiring his skill. Deliritus snapped his fingers, then stopped speaking a moment later. An instant too late, Baz realized that had been the signal to turn the page. He fumbled at the page, but only managed to give himself a paper cut. Deliritus cursed, and Tax yelped out in pain as Baz felt a rush of power leap from the altar, straight toward where the woman stood with her chicks. Several sickening pops were quickly followed by a scream. Baz looked up in time to see the lady trip over backward and fall to the speaking room's stone floor, some of the splattered remains of her chicks staining her dress, face, and, Baz noted with particular chagrin, her hair. "Bastion, you—" Deliritus half raised a hand to strike him, then appeared to reconsider and instead just shook his head in disgust. "Rox, get over there and help her. I'm sorry, good woman, but these things do happen. I'll see you receive recompense from the treasury for this mishap." The woman looked horrified at the prospect of Deliritus giving her any more help. She managed to get herself up before Rox reached her and ran from the speaking room without a backward glance. She left the ruined basket behind on the floor. On the floor, right next to a displaced flagstone she must have tripped over during her fall. Rox bent over the exposed hole. "What's this?" he boomed, leaning over and coming up with the book Tax had placed there, the book from which Baz had been reading right before Deliritus had entered. "Why, that's the missing book of destruction. Burning take me. Father had 3 servants executed because he suspected they'd taken it. And it's been here the whole time." Rox rumbled. "That's not all." The foreboding tone of the harbor's voice sent waves through Baz's already roiling stomach. He looked to his brother, but Tax was standing rail straight and staring straight ahead. "There's this." Rox plucked the bookmark from the book and handed it to Deliritus. It was a thin strip of leather, perhaps 2 fingers wide and about as long as a book was tall. The symbols of each of the three branches of the Trinity were burned into it with dark brands. The trees of the Creator, Liamina Fortune, the dragons of the Destroyer, Hellfax erstwhile, and the scales of the Enigma, Pront V Lexdor. The same three symbols were branded on Tax's forehead, marking him a try. "Why," Deliritus said, turning the bookmark over in his hands, "this is—" His eyes widened as they darted over to Tax. He took a step back. "This is your father's marker," yelled Tax. "I remember my own father gave it to you after your father's, retirement. It was you who took the book?" Baz opened his mouth to cry a defense of his brother, but the sudden blaze in Tax's eyes snapped Baz's mouth shut. Deliritus looked away from Tax, continuing to turn the bookmark over and over in his hands, as if it would give him some answer. "You've been reading, haven't you? Father warned me you might be too smart for your own good, but I told him you'd never do such a thing. Shows how much I know." "Master Deliritus," Tax said, voice unbelievably calm, "I'm not sure how that book got there, but I assure you—" "He wasn't going to hurt anyone," Baz blurted, certain that saying something would be helpful. Tax's mouth hung open mid-word for several seconds, then slowly closed. Deliritus's stayed open for much longer. The sad smile Tax gave Baz would be imprinted in Baz's mind for the rest of his life. Silence stretched for some time. Baz yearned for his brother to say something smart that would cancel this whole thing out, show it for some great misunderstanding. It had been Baz who'd suggested using Father's marker in the book. "Let's put it to its intended purpose," he'd told Tax. Tax hadn't wanted to initially, but finally he'd agreed after seeing how happy it made Baz. Now look where that stupid sentiment had gotten them. "Well," Deliritus finally said, voice a whisper, hard and sad all at once, "there's only one thing we can do to a cuss, Rox. Kill him." "No!" Baz cried, turning on Deliritus. "No, I won't let you." "Baz, stop," Tax said. "Don't make this even harder than it's already going to be." "Come, Rox," Deliritus said with an urgency in his tone, as if this were somehow hurting him. "Get on with it." Baz's eyes darted to Rox, as if the massive man could hold any hope for him. But the giant actually seemed to be hesitating. "A threat to you he is not," Rox said. "Not a threat!" Deliritus' voice came out a shrill whine. "A cuss could lay waste to this library, Rox, and if the other libraries here we let one go unpunished, Torchsire would be no more. Every library in the Triumvirate would send assassins in a matter of days. How safe do you think I'd be then?" Rox turned his head to one side as if considering, then exhaled in what might have been a sigh. "I hear truth. The words mean what they mean." He began to walk toward Tax. "Keep breathing, Baz," Tax said, standing tall in the harbor shadow. "Keep surviving." Baz never forgot the sound of his brother's screams. Welcome back to DT Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. Today is January 22nd, 2022, as I record this. Hope you enjoyed those 2 chapters there we just read. Got some great listener questions to go over as well. So why don't we hop right in here? Quick personal update before we jump into our analysis of chapters 1 and 2 of the Acktus Trials. By the time this episode airs, the Acktus Trials, which is the novel we're reading right now, will be available for purchase at most online retailers where you find books, both as an ebook and as a physical copy. So if you can't wait for the next 20 or so episodes and you need to find out what happens right now, you can go pick yourself up a copy. Or if you just want to have your own copy to read along with the podcast, you can do that as well. Got a couple current projects in the hopper right now as well. Part 2 of the Spoken Books Uprising is currently with my editor. I expect that to release probably around the end of April, maybe mid-April. We'll have to see. I'll keep you updated on that as I go through there, because once I get my edits back from the editor, I have to obviously go through and review all of them, which does take a little time. I've also just finished my first round of personal edits on part 3 of the Spoken Books Uprising, so I've got 2 completed manuscripts hanging around right now. From there, my process is to print out the manuscript and edit it by hand. So I do a round of edits on the computer after my first draft, and then after that, I print it out and go over it with pen, and then enter all of those back into the computer. And then once I'm done with that, part 3 will go to my editor as well. And right now, my schedule, looking to release the 3rd part around June 1st, so start of the summer. So you'll have 3 books to read by the middle of the year. For those of you who are interested, part 2 is called Declaimer's Discovery, and part 3 is Declaimer's Flight. And just for full disclosure, for those of you who are completionists out there, part 3 is not the final part. I've actually got this sketched out right now to span probably about 12 books. I've got 12 stories that I know I need to tell. I don't know if it's going to be 12 books or if a couple of those stories might merge into one book, but lots more books to come. I do try to tell a complete story in each book, but the broader arc of the whole series definitely goes past part 3, so lots to stay tuned for, and we'll be reading each of those books together in order once we complete the Acktus Trials here. Okay, so enough about me and what I'm doing. Let's hop into our discussion of chapters 1 and 2 of the Acktus Trials. And of course, if you have any suggestions for how I can structure our discussions differently in future weeks, definitely send them to me. I am open. This is podcast episode number 2, so still a bit of a rookie here, so I'm happy for any suggestions that you think might improve the listening experience here. dtkane at dtkane.com. You can send your suggestions there. All right, so last week I told you to specifically keep an eye on what the older brother, who is Yeltax, or Tax for short, is teaching his younger brother, Bastian, or Baz for short. Now, right off the bat, we have a rather odd admonition, right? Reading books can get you killed. I know this technically isn't the first line of the book, since we had a prologue, but it's the first line of chapter 1, so it's sort of the first line of the book, right? I try not to put too much stock in opening lines, but many folks are so obsessed with that flashy first sentence, it's hard for me to completely disregard it. I like to think this one's pretty provocative, right? Reading books can get you killed. I slapped it on the back cover of the physical copy as well. I also like how it kind of speaks to the whole high-level concept of the novel and really the whole series, too. And that interesting point here, that actually gets to a reader question I have here. So why don't we go over that now? Linda from New York writes, DT, what was your inspiration for the Spoken Books Uprising? Well, thanks for the question, Linda. This is a fun one. My original inspiration for the series was this idea, what if reading books was a superpower, That's kind of cool. I like reading. It'd be cool if I was if I was considered to have special powers because I could read. And that's kind of what I've done here at a high level. Obviously this isn't a superhero book, but basically in this world, if you can read, you are a badass, right? It's the only way to cast magic. And like I said, as a lifelong reader and generally one who obsesses over books, that's pretty cool. Most people think you're a nerd if you like reading, but not here in the land of oration. You are the coolest kid in school if you can read. Now, of course, as neat as that concept is, I couldn't just leave it at that. We need some complications. We can't just have a story about a universe where reading is a superpower. Stories are ultimately about complications, right? Let's take some characters and throw a bunch of obstacles between them and what they want. That's how we keep things interesting. So I thought, how could I twist this idea of reading as a superpower into something, more interesting and more complicated? So my first level was, What if only certain people can unlock the power of the magic books? Okay, all right, that's going somewhere. So, that kind of creates this potential for an upper class of folks who can read, while all the normal people can't cast magic. Good. There's some beginnings there, but lots of stories with magic are like that, right? Not everyone can cast it. So, another layer on top of that. Not everyone can cast magic from the books, and those who can are enslaved and never taught to read. All right, now maybe we have a little more something there. You can see a whole culture forming around that single idea, and it also evokes some pretty strong emotions, I think. These people are born with such an awesome power, but they're downtrodden and never given a chance to exercise it. There is a story in there. At least, obviously, I think so, because I've written 3 books about it already. Right, and like I said, as many as a dozen books based on this single idea. So, right, reading can get you killed. Yale text establishes this for us in the very first sentence, and as I just said, there's a whole lot packed in there about the whole series in that one sentence. We quickly learn he's not exaggerating, right? Because he tells us, just a few paragraphs in, that his father was killed by the readers, not even because he could read, but simply because they thought he might be learning the basics of grammar. Just the risk of him maybe learning to read one day was enough to get him killed. So the readers, who are the ruling class in this society, really don't want people like Yeltax and his father learning to read. We get some more details as to why this is the case later, but since reading equals power, obviously the readers want to keep that power away from their slaves. And yet, we quickly realize that despite that, how dangerous apparently reading is, Tax is teaching his little brother to read. Obviously he's not doing this lightly, because he makes the point of reminding Baz that he promised their father to look out for Baz, yet he's still submitting him to this danger. There seems to be a bit of a rebel in Yeltax, right? What does he say? Quote right from the text here. Someone ought to be able to stand up to them. So he's teaching his brother to read in hopes that one day he might stand up to the readers. Another interesting point here in the opening pages and paragraphs, and this is an example of something I'll always try to point out, bits of text that might not be obviously important when you first read them, but that'll become so over the course of the book. Tax tells Baz that a man always keeps his promises. That's what sets us apart from the readers, Baz. We keep our word. Don't forget that. Heavy. We see the deep distrust Tax has for the readers here, and I guess you can't blame him since they killed his dad, not even for committing a crime, but just the possibility that he might commit one in the future. And we also see the value that Tax puts on keeping his word. You're as bad as the readers if you don't do that. Even to a young boy like his little brother Baz here, that's got to make some impact, you would think, right? It looks like Tax is probably the only, father figure Baz has got. So, as sarcastic as Baz can be here at times, you got to think there's some influence that's going to have on him. So remember that sentiment, and it's going to echo across parts of the rest of the book. We'll keep coming back to that. Okay, so after those kind of opening pages where we go over, what happened to Baz and Tax's father, next kind of major piece of information we have 3 types of speakers. We've got destroyers, creators, and influencers. Baz is a destroyer, and we know that because he's got a dragon branded on his forehead, which is the symbol of all the destroyer speakers. And that also gives you a bit more of an idea of how the readers treat their slaves, right? They're marking them like cattle. They're really, obviously if they're slaves, they're not being treated well to begin with, but, they're really not treating them much better than animals, it seems like. We also learn here that Tax is what's called a tri, which means he is all 3 types of speakers in one. And this is apparently very rare, so he enjoys some special privileges that other slaves don't. For instance, free time during the middle of the day to spend with his brother. And I think, obviously, it doesn't come right out and say this, but, certainly shows, how much he cares for Baz, right? He's using his work breaks to chill with little bro and teach him, right? Instead of resting or, doing something else to relax. Other than that, we don't learn a ton about the distinctions between the three types of speakers yet. And for these opening chapters, you don't really need to. We'll learn more about them later. But we do get a couple of analogies that Baz offers for each of them. And I'll just reread those to you to give you an idea. I think you can probably tell from the names and then these analogies here, the general idea of what each of these types of magic do. But here's what Baz said. Baz had once heard a conservator compare the language of creation to a doe lapping water from a creek, and the language of influence to the drumming of marching men's steps, steady and inevitable. Destruction, however, wasn't nearly so straightforward. Some of its syllables were like the menacing snort of a bull, others a falcon's high screech, and still others like the refined, sharp edges of a lion's roar. The three types of speakers. And while we don't get any more detail about the three types of speakers, we do learn that there are dangers associated with reading spells from spoken books. Tex and Baz are in what's called a speaking room, right? And it's built so that it's away from the rest of the building. Apparently that's done because, as Baz tells us, speakings can go terribly wrong. While that's rare, we learn that a reading room of one of the other libraries in the city was recently destroyed by a spell gone wrong. And apparently speakers can also be injured by misspoken spells. Baz speaks of having burned the inside of his mouth the last time he tried to speak a spell. And he also mentions the possibility of scorched lungs, which sounds worse than burning the inside of your mouth to me. So reading is both illegal for speakers, and it also carries physical risks if you don't know what you're doing. Another interesting tidbit that'll be relevant here throughout the novel. Torchsire Library, which is where we are during this scene. It's the library that Baz and Tex belong to. Has one shelf of books in its library, and that shelf is only half full. So they don't have too many books, right? Just one shelf, and it's not even full. But we learn that while this makes Torchsire Library one of the city's smaller libraries, that few books is still considered a grand fortune. So we can glean from that there's certainly a premium on books in this world, right? There aren't a lot of them, and the ones that do exist hold power that can cast magic. So, again here you see how that single concept of a world where magic comes only from books, it's quickly creating lots of rules for the culture here. Naturally, books are going to be extremely valuable in this society. All right, so, those are the major things we learned in this chapter up until the end when Tex and Baz finally get around to, letting Baz actually do the reading that Baz has eagerly been waiting for the whole chapter. One thing additionally we do learn, we learned about these the stop runes, right, at the towards the end of the chapter. Baz is being impatient. He's rolling his eyes at his overprotector brother, eager to set something on fire, like I'm sure a lot of you were when you were kids. Fire was really cool, right? Lots of us probably think it's still really cool. He finally gets to do his speaking, but only after we learn about the stop runes. These are sort of like the safety on a gun, right? Before you read a spell, you read the stop rune, and it prevents someone from repeating the same spell and using it against you, right? This was a concept I kind of came up with after starting drafting, because I was writing this for a while, and I was like, well, geez, if you're in a fight with spoken books, right, and you read a spell out of it, well, someone's going to hear that. Why can't they just repeat it and use it right back at you? It'd be like if you fired a gun at someone, they'd be able to fire the bullet back at you. So I had to come up with some way to have some sort of protection against that, and that's what the stop runes do here. And we also learned you can use them as a sort of a mulligan, right? They have more than one purpose. You speak the stop rune, and none of the ill effects of misreading a spell will occur. I guess I should say you speak it again, right? So you speak it at the beginning to prevent anyone from rereading your spell and casting it against you. But if you're in the middle of the spell and you mess up, you can read the stop rune again, and then that apparently stops the spell. And that's good, right? So there's a way around blowing up the room if you screw up. So I guess that explains, too, why, while it's possible for these spells to go terribly wrong, they don't that often because you can just read this stop rune. Still, even with that, you can get a sense of some of Baz's anxiety, right, as he begins to read. He's failed and burned his mouth at least once, so even what's apparently a rather simple spell still carries consequences of failure, right? He's just trying to light a candle here, but you can still hurt yourself even doing that. But that's, at least for Baz, that's not a good thing, right? But for us, that's good. You want a magic system that has costs and drawbacks. If you can just snap your fingers and cast whatever magic you want, you're in for some pretty overpowered characters. And those are, those can be fun to read for a while, but, often some of the most interesting things you're going to get in fantasy books are, what the magic cannot do, right? Instead of what it can do. You can only read about blowing down doors with fireballs and, blowing people up with lightning from the sky for so long before it gets a little boring. Right, so Baz successfully lights his candle. Right, he gets through the speaking, and he is very excited. Right, he immediately wants to go on and read another spell. But before we get there, the door to the room swings open, and suddenly all these dire warnings from the beginning of the chapter become extremely relevant. Right, their father was killed for just suggesting he might learn to read one day. And here Tax and Baz are with a stolen book. Tax is apparently able to read it well enough to teach his brother, and Baz has just read a spell from it. So they're doing a whole bunch of things here they shouldn't be doing. And we've seen the penalty for this is probably getting executed. So they're in some serious trouble here with whoever just opened that door. But thankfully, we move right along to chapter 2 here, so you aren't left hanging. So let's move on to our analysis of chapter 2. All right, chapter 2. This episode is running longer than I think the typical one will go, but I really wanted to get through part 1 of the book today, which is just chapters 1 and 2, because it's really just one long sequence that sets up a lot of stuff. So let's keep barreling on here. So the door to the reading room, or speaking room actually, typed reading room here, I'll have to fix that. So the speaking room door opens and we collectively hold our breaths, right, as we turn the page. But it's essentially a false alarm, right? A guy who comes in can't see that Tax and Baz have a spoken book with them because he's got this huge stack of books covering his face. Tex quickly hides the book beneath a loose stone in the floor, and crisis averted, at least for now, anyway. So now we meet Deliritus, the youth behind the stack of books. You might not be able to tell here, but I like Deliritus. He's certainly one to watch if you buckle in for the long haul on this podcast and the Spoken Books Uprising series. Though I'll admit in this chapter we're sort of scrambling to find redeeming characteristics in him, right? Flamboyant and cavalier, maybe a couple adjectives that that come to mind to describe him here. I mean, let's start with his outfit, right? A velveteen tunic. Geez, that sounds, just that word sounds too fancy, right? And he's wearing this giant hat with a purple feather sticking from it. Think like a musketeer hat here, large and in charge. And it's probably too big for him, right? I don't say that in the text, but I do tell you he's 13 years old and an awkward 13 at that. Below average height, but he's outgrowing his clothes, so they never seem to fit. Maybe we've got a bit of a walking around in dad's shoes type image going on here with Deliritus. That's trying to what I was hoping to get across to you here. Drop me a line if you think I could have done that better. So we get the sense too that he's a bit entitled, maybe more than a bit entitled, right? He's heir by default rather than really merit. Baz makes no secret of noting that, and he's his father's only child. Baz makes a point to say how ridiculous it is, Deliritus walking around with a stack of spoken books. This is sort of like our world's equivalent of strolling around with a Ming vase under each arm, right? Just extremely, extremely reckless. Just you're walking around with your house's fortune, just carelessly carrying it around. Then then Deliritus opens his mouth, right? And our opinion of him is not getting any better. In the first 2 pages, right? We meet him. He makes these 2 awful, insensitive jokes. There's the one about letting Yeltax keep his eyes. What's that about? The implication there is that not all speakers get to keep their eyes, right? I guess that makes sense in a chilling sort of way, right? They don't need to see. They just got to be able to talk and hear, right? So, they're not supposed to be able to read, even though that we know Tax can. So, do we have blind speakers walking around? Maybe some of the readers do that to their slaves just to make sure they really can never learn to read. I don't know. We'll have to see where that goes. And then just a few paragraphs later, Deliritus makes this other joke about how it won't be his mouth that burns if he mispronounces a word. It's Yeltax who, if he mispronounces a spell, he suffers the consequences. At least he's got shame enough to realize that one fell on deaf ears, right? He clears his throat and smooths out his unwrinkled tunic when no one laughs. But still, we're obviously, left with the image of a self-centered, entitled youth here for Deliritus. And I guess I will add here, despite Deliritus' privileged status, we do also get a sense of how comparatively privileged Yeltax might be, at least compared to Baz and most of the rest of the speakers in this world. They're both slaves, right? But we see Deliritus immediately addressing Tax, whereas he doesn't even seem to realize Baz is present for quite a while. And when he finally does notice him, what do I say here? Deliritus looks around the room as if there might be some place he could hide Baz. He doesn't even want Baz to be there. We get this sense that Baz's experience is definitely a lot closer to the norm for speakers. We read in the text, quote, Baz, along with the vast majority of other speakers, was expected to remain silent unless a question was directed to him or he was actively repeating a reader's words from a spoken book. And actually Baz drops an interesting bit of info here right after that. Quote, as often as not, a reader would assume that a speaker who opened his mouth out of turn was attempting to cast a spell. And if a reader believed that, well, speakers were far less expensive to replace than a reader. In case you were wondering what's to stop speakers from turning on their masters by repeating a spell, well, we've got the stop rune. We already read about that in the previous chapter. Remember, that's the safety on the gun. We've also got this sort of startling cultural reality where, just by talking, a speaker is risking death, right? That's a pretty good way to keep yourself safe if you're a reader. If your speakers are frightened to talk at all, then, you got much less worry about them speaking spells that might harm you, right? Right. So that's Deliritus, our introduction to him. And then we've got, our other big introduction to the chapter, right? And, the pun is intended there. Rox is a huge dude, right? He walks through the door. He makes those oak doors seem small. We're talking about big double doors leading into the speaking room, and he makes them look small. We read he's 2 feet taller than Deliritus, and while we said earlier Deliritus is below average in height, Baz also makes the point he's not particularly short. Deliritus is no midget, and he's 13. So what? That makes him he's got to be over 5 feet tall, right? So, and Rox is 2 feet taller than that. So we're talking like a Shaquille O'Neal sized guy here at least. Maybe the Mountain from Game of Thrones, perhaps. Let's bring this back to fantasy here. He's bald, sort of grayish skin. When we see Darth Vader take his helmet off at the end of Return of the Jedi, that's sort of what I picture when I think of Rox. This very pale, pasty, bald guy. Except obviously Rox is in good health, whereas Darth Vader was dying there at the end of Return of the Jedi. And then he's got this Hannibal Lecter type face mask too. So this is a creepy looking guy. He is a scarred, bald man with gray skin, wearing essentially a leather muzzle over his nose and mouth. Certainly the image of someone you probably don't want to be in the same room with. Then almost immediately after we meet him, he kind of proves he's maybe not someone you want to be around. This little old lady startles him and nearly chops her head off, right? Now, I guess we could make the argument at this point he's just overprotective of Deliritus, right? Rather than just a bloodthirsty killer. He does not actually kill the woman. He just jumps it, but maybe he perceived as a threat. I don't know. It's like I said, it's not entirely clear. And we do learn, to Rox's credit here, he's sworn an oath to protect Deliritus, and he seems particularly obsessed with the meaning of words. The words mean what they mean. Rox repeats this, I think, at least twice in this opening, in this chapter 2, and he's going to say that again and again. That's his catchphrase here. But even if he does take his oath pretty seriously, we're not getting warm and fuzzies about him at this point. And his weapon is not making you want to cuddle, or his weapon, that's not making you want to cuddle with him either, right? I don't know how well my description does it for you. I think it's all right, but, to put it in kind of, simpler terms here, let's, picture an old-fashioned straight razor, right? The one that folds into its handle like a pocket knife. So, picture that in your mind, except this thing is several feet long. The back of it looks like a saw instead of just, like the flat part you would use to fold up the razor. And then you can snap it open, right? So think just like, you flick your wrist and this thing extends to like twice its length. And then he's got this slashing style type weapon. So it's jagged on one side and like a cleaver on the other side. He is ready to fight Freddy Krueger with this thing. You do not want to see Rox coming down the hall late at night holding his razor. And we were just talking about things that are keeping speakers from attacking their readers. So, here's another safety for the readers, right? If every reader has a giant protector like Rox, and we're going to learn that they all do, though they're not all as giant as Rox is. But speakers are going to think twice about attacking their reader if they've got a dude like Rox watching out for them. Right. So we learn it's Deliritus' job to see to Torchsire Library's supplicants this day. Apparently this is a frequent ritual and one that makes the library money. Poor people come to the library to ask the readers to use their magic to cure various problems, and Torchsire needs this apparently, right? We've got this, funny for us, embarrassing for Deliritus exchange where he basically admits in front of this old woman that Torchsire Library doesn't even have enough money to pay a full rotation of guards. Something about money being tight since an injury to Deliritus' father. No more info about that here for now, but let's keep that in mind going forward. We do get this sense of Deliritus being a bit of a bumbling incompetent, right? Baz certainly seems to think that. And, Deliritus doesn't really seem to know how to act like a noble, even though he is one. Even the old woman doesn't seem to have much confidence in him, right? She tries more than once to sort of back out of having Deliritus read the spell once she learns Deliritus' father isn't coming. Obviously, the implication here is Deliritus' father is pretty well regarded as a reader, while Deliritus certainly is not. And you can see how that makes sense here, right? This lady is coming, hoping to get her baby chicks healed, right? And the Duke's 13-year-old son shows up instead of the most powerful man in the library, and this seems to be she seems to be right. Deliritus doesn't even seem to know what type of spell he needs to read to help the chickens out. Baz's brother has to ultimately point him in the right direction. Deliritus covers with this lame excuse that he was just giving Yeltax a test, right? But obviously he was just clueless, and someone who is the slave had to clue him in. But finally we do get the right book up on the podium. Delirious makes this offhand comment about the ink in it being faded and needing to send it to the conservators for restoration. Tax responds to that there appears to be enough elemental ink left in the book for at least several more readings before the book will lose its power. So this is kind of just a brief exchange here, but two kind of really important things about the world are revealed. First, kind of the implied point here, spoken books apparently wear out over time. Their ink fades with each reading. But apparently, even though they wear out, they can be restored, and there's apparently a whole group who are called the conservators that do that. Again, coming back to all these interesting things that go straight from the novel's basic concept. So in a world where books hold power, keeping your books in good order is going to be, it's going to be important, right? If you don't have books, you don't have power. So it makes sense that there would be a profession that's kind of sprung up that restores books and keeps them working and as fresh as they can be. So if I was a betting man, and maybe a little bit of a spoiler here, I would say those restorers likely hold some power in oration. But we'll have to wait and see for that until next week. We'll see these conservators in a bit more action in Chapter 3. And the more explicit thing that comes from this exchange between Delirious and Tax is that Tax makes a pretty serious mistake here, right? He lets slip that he was looking at the text of Delirious' book. And even here, Delirious, entitled, cavalier, slightly incompetent, even he gets dangerously quiet at this, threatening Tax never to do that again. The moment's gone like that, right? We, immediately go back to the Delirious we've seen for the rest of the scene. But you certainly get the sense from his quick shift out of his yappy incompetence, just how dire it is of a speaker doing something that even suggests he has an interest in books. Remember that, again, we keep coming back to this, but, we learned in Chapter 1, Baz's father was killed just for suggesting he might be learning how to read. Not that he could read, just that he might be beginning to grasp the basics of grammar. So, Tex gets away with that here, but it just drives home how dangerous it is for someone in Tex or Baz's position to know how to read a book. One other interesting thing to note here, I think, is while inwardly criticizing Delirious for his dismay over how long the spoken books tend to be, and if you're having trouble picturing them, let me back up there for a minute. So if you're having trouble picturing what these books like, we're talking like, books the size of like a Bible that a priest might read at Mass. These things are not transport friendly. Baz notes that one reason for their size is that all the elemental ink in them is needed to serve as sort of a fuel to power the spells that are being read. So some more interesting insight into the magic system here. We've learned the elemental ink fades over time as you read from the books again and again, and now we see that the reason for that fading is because the person who is casting the spell from the book is actually drawing power right out of the ink in the books. And this maybe explains something else you might have been wondering. You can't just memorize the spell and then go about casting magic without the book, right? You need the words of the spell, but you also need the fuel of the spell's ink to cast the magic. So a further limitation here. It's not just like, you memorize the book and go on your merry way. You got to have the book with you. It's like it's like the power cell, or with our gun analogy earlier, it's like the ammunition. You need the book. It's not just about the words. All right, so we finally get to see our first reading, where the reader is reading the spell and then the speaker is repeating it. So just to set the stage, we've got Delirious up at his podium, Baz is beside him, turning the pages, and Tex is off to the side with Rock standing behind him, keeping watch for any signs of betrayal. And of course, we have this poor old woman looking on who just wants her little chicks healed and doesn't really want Delirious to be the one healing them. Delirious starts his reading. Baz, of course, immediately hypercritical of him, as he has been for the whole chapter. If you hadn't gotten it by now, you probably haven't been paying attention, but Baz does not like Delirious much, and that's not gonna change, right? After what happens here in a few moments. But for now, we see that Delirious isn't too good at reading, right? So Baz's criticism seems to be warranted. But despite how bad Deliritus is, Tax is so skilled that he can still repeat the spells properly, even though Deliritus' pronunciation is really bad. That is, Tex is able to repeat the spells fine until Baz loses his focus and doesn't turn the page, right? Deliritus tries to get his attention, snapping his fingers at him, but it's too late. The spell fizzles. Tex yelps out in pain, presumably because the spell has failed and has burned him. And the poor chicks, I'm sorry for all the animal lovers out there, but we lose them. They're, big bloody mess. Remember, we've already established misread spells can have dire consequences, and here we see one. We were casting this spell to kill the virus inside the chicks, and instead the spell has been misread, and it killed the chicks themselves. Our poor old lady here trips to the floor, then goes rushing from the room. Her fears of Deliritus's incompetence having proven completely true, apparently, at least in her eyes. And interestingly here, while we see Deliritus is obviously furious with Baz for messing up the spell, he restrains himself from hitting Baz. Now, obviously, in our world, this would be no great feat. You're not supposed to go around hitting people when you get mad. But in the world of, a master-slave relationship, this does seem like a bit of unexpected restraint, right? Maybe Deliritus isn't quite as bad as he seems. We already got this implication that maybe some readers purposefully blind their speakers, and Deliritus seems hesitant to even hit one of his. So, or maybe Deliritus just didn't want to hurt his hand. I don't know. We haven't had a whole lot of reason yet to give Deliritus any benefit of the doubt, so we'll have to wait and see. We'll be seeing plenty more of Deliritus in the chapters to come. Of course, the woman's fall and quick exit reveal something horrifying for Tex and Baz. That stone in the floor where they've hidden their book. It comes loose and Rox sees it. Now, maybe they could explain it away, except for, the bookmark. I think we mentioned the bookmark very briefly, just kind of offhand threw it in there earlier. But apparently, this is a bookmark that used to belong to Tax and Baz's father, and Deliritus recognizes it, which means even he is able to put together that Tax or Baz must be the one who put the book there. Tax displays kind of remarkable composure here, right? But Baz, he just can't help himself. He's still a little kid. He just wants his brother to be okay, so he blurts out that Tax never meant to hurt anyone, which of course has the exact opposite effect of what Baz wants, because that proves that Tax is indeed the one who stole the book. Of course, Baz meant well here, but he has inadvertently sealed his brother's fate now, right? And we also learned that it was Baz's idea to use their father's bookmark, right? So we've got the failed page turn, Baz inadvertently revealing his brother stole the book, and also the bookmark that gave them away. So Baz, the reasons for feeling guilty here are piling onto Baz here rather quickly. And we all know what happens now, right? You just listened. You just listened to it. Deliritus orders Rox to kill Tax. Now, interesting. Did you catch that Rox displays some hesitance here? He, as we went over in detail a few minutes ago, Rox certainly looks like he's a bloodthirsty monster, but he doesn't just jump at the opportunity to kill Tax. In fact, he makes a point to reference back his oath. Tax is not posing a threat to Deliritus right now, so why should Rox kill him? Of course, Deliritus retorts that Tax's very existence as a speaker who can also read, which we learn is called a cuss in this world. So a speaker who also learns to read, they're a cuss. What Deliritus, let's see, his exact words, he could lay waste to this library, Deliritus tells us. And he also says it's illegal for a library to permit a cuss to live, or at least to go unpunished. So maybe a little unclear if killing is absolutely necessary, but you certainly have to punish them. And the other libraries would send assassins if they let the cuss go unpunished. So do we think that's because the other libraries are afraid of the cuss, or maybe that's because they don't want a competing library to have such a powerful individual under their control? Not entirely clear here exactly why the other libraries would send assassins. But regardless, even though Rox isn't thrilled with this explanation, He says, he says in his deliberate, low-voiced way, he hears the truth and delivers his words, and he moves forward to carry out his master's command. Keep breathing, Baz, Tex says right before Rox reaches him. Keep surviving. And then, of course, the chapter ends, with Tex screaming. So, well, not the happiest of endings to this week's reading, but hopefully you're motivated to read or listen onward to see what happens next. What's going to happen to Baz now that he doesn't have his brother? Does he get punished as well? We will have to wait and see until next week what happens to Baz. So we'll read Chapter 3 next week, which begins Part 2 of the Acktus Trials. Baz meets an illit, which is, I think we heard that word a couple times in Chapters 1 and 2, but that's basically a commoner or a peasant in this world here. And Baz's interaction with this illit tells us a fair bit about society, so pay attention there. Then Baz heads off to the conservatory. We learned today that the conservators have the job of restoring the spoken books, right? When they wear out. It'll be interesting to see a little bit more about what the conservators are all about. And then we'll meet another new character, Liana. What do you think of her and how Baz interacts with her? And finally, see if you can catch the reference to the novel's title somewhere in Chapter 3. And I think that's it for your homework this week. But remember, if you don't do it, no problem, because I'll be doing your reading and answering all these questions and much more next week. Let's see. Got one other listener question here. Quick one. Tom writes, DT, who's your favorite author? Well, thanks for the question, Tom. Probably Robert Jordan. Author of the Wheel of Time series, obviously, just because those books had such a substantial impact on my writing, and also just my general enjoyment of fantasy, just the sprawling epic and world that Jordan created. I just love that, and a lot of my writing does stem from stuff he does or did, unfortunately. I also like Joe Abercrombie a lot. His first Slaw series is excellent. I don't really write a lot like him though, but I do really enjoy his books. I also like Jim Butcher in his Dresden Files books. They're just they're a lot of fun, and I guess I try at times to channel some of the dark sarcasm that his main character uses in those books too. So those are a few of my favorites. Again, thanks for the question. This week's quest, and I guess I should say I gave you the quest last week about the book dragon we met in the prologue and who you thought my influence for that character was, or what you think my influence for the book dragon was. Since I'm kind of pre-recording these first few episodes, so I think I'm not going to give the answers to any of these quests that I've given you so far, probably until about probably the first episode in March of 2022. So if you are listening anytime before then, feel free to send in your answers to that quest and any other ones given before March to dtkane@dtkane.com, and then we'll go over all of those quest answers in the first episode of March 2022. So this week's quest, about how old is Baz in chapters 1 and 2? Doesn't come right out and say it, but you can figure it out from the context. So shoot me an email if you figure that out. I think we'll just do one experience point for this quest. And finally, like I said last week, I'm going to close with a quote each week. This week's comes from George R.R. Martin, of course, the author of the Game of Thrones series. A reader lives 1,000 lives before he dies. The man who never reads lives only one. I like that. Read books, people. You learn a lot and you'll have lots of fun. And if you do like reading books, tune in next week and we will read some more of mine, the Acktus Trials from the Spoken Books Uprising series. So until next time, I'm DT Kane, and this has been DT Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. Thanks for listening to DT Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. If you liked today's episode, please consider rating and reviewing wherever you listen to podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and hit that subscribe button and the bell so you get notified whenever new episodes become available. If you'd like to listen to back episodes or review the show notes, visit dtkane.com/podcast. DT Kane's novels are available for purchase at most major online retailers, or you can purchase directly from his website at www.dtkane.com/books. You can receive a free short story and sign up for DT Kane's mailing list at dtkane.com/email-signup. If you'd like to connect, you can find DT Kane on Facebook at DT Kane Author or Twitter at DT Kane Author, or send DT Kane an email at dtkane@dtkane.com. See you next week.